On November 26th of 2019, I released my review of Call of Duty Modern Warfare to YouTube, and I heard a lot of people saying the same thing after it was over. With people talking about the single-player campaign, I heard a lot of people drawing comparisons to another game called Spec Ops: The Line, a game I had heard about mostly by praise, but by that point had never actually gone out and played myself. I had seen some of the gameplay and heard about how people had said it's one of the best shooter campaigns ever made, but to that point had never actually gone out and played it, so I went up and picked it up and started playing it over my winter break, and completed it within 3 days. I'll be discussing this game pretty in-depth, so grab your popcorn. Spec Ops: The Line in terms of its campaign is what I like to call a no-way-out scenario. Throughout the story, it approaches you with a lot of decisions, none of which lead anywhere good, but by design you have to choose what seems to be the most logical. Logic, rationale, and morals are 3 recurring themes that will be discussed in this video. On the surface, Spec Ops: The Line just seems like your typical third-person shooter that comes out every 5 months, but there's so much more to it than just that. There's so much more to it than even I could have imagined. So with that said, let's get this review of Spec Ops: The Line underway, but I do warn you, spoilers and mature content ahead. Contrary to popular belief, Spec Ops: The Line is actually not the first Spec Ops game. Believe it or not, there were several games in a series called Spec Ops that ran from 1998 up until 2002. The games were developed by Zombie Studios, a studio that has unfortunately since shut down, and the Spec Ops games were published across their history by 3 different publishers. Ripcord Games were the first ones, developing the first 2 games in the series before eventually dropping the mantle to Take-Two Interactive in 1999. And Take-Two worked on publishing the games from 2000 until 2001, then Gotham Games developed Spec Ops: Airline Commando, which released in 2002. The eventual release for the next game was eventually scrapped in 2004, mostly due to the past Spec Ops games receiving poor reviews and not doing successfully. People then went years without any trace of a new Spec Ops game, and the series also went largely unmentioned for a long period of time. In fact, there's only 1 review on the entirety of YouTube of the first game in the series, Spec Ops: Rangers Lead the Way, and it was by Examine Life of Gaming, a channel that intentionally covers forgotten and obscure games. However, in 2006, German-based developer Jaeger Development pitched the idea of a gritty, realistic, cover-based third-person shooter to 2K Games. The original concept was allegedly going to have a lot more of a futuristic setting without Dubai as its location. However, 2K rejected the original idea and gave them an opportunity to reboot the Spec Ops series, whilst also promising Jaeger a lot more freedom to express their creativity with the game. Development of Spec Ops: The Line began in early 2007, and while Spec Ops: The Line would be considered a game within the Spec Ops series, Jaeger wanted to challenge themselves by trying their best not to include much pre-existing material from the older games. The setting of the game being in a war-torn and damaged Dubai came from one of the pasts of the lead developers, Walt Williams, and his experiences with hurricanes, heat waves, and sandstorms. Using Dubai as a setting was what allowed Jaeger to incorporate sand of all things into the game as one of its core mechanics. The game was officially announced on December 12, 2009 at the Spike Video Game Awards with a trailer that showed off lots of gameplay in the game's Dubai setting. A press release detailed more about the game as well as a possible release date for sometime in 2011. Designer of the game Corey Davis felt that the game was announced too soon. He thought the excitement the announcement for the game caused would die down too far before the release date. Later on, an official release date was scheduled for the game to release in November of 2011, but this would eventually get delayed, instead with the game being released in North America on June 26, 2012 for Xbox 360, PS3, and PC. So already when you boot up Spec Ops: The Line for the first time, right away it already gives you a certain vibe of what the tone will likely be. In the main menu when you first start up the game, there's a tattered American flag dangled down an electric guitar cover playing the US national anthem. It may not seem like much on surface level, but I think it definitely serves as a metaphor for what the game will become over time. I think it's also worth mentioning the fact that as you play through the campaign more and more, the music changes, the menu changes, and even the tips in the loading screens change. I'll give additional context to the loading screen tips part in a second when we move on to talking about the campaign, but it's also worth mentioning that even the place of the American flag changes around the menus as the game continues. The point of this section of the video is to tell you how, without even playing the campaign, when you first boot up the game, you can already start to tell what the game is going to be like. So, gameplay in Spec Ops: The Line is overall fairly similar to other gameplay in modern shooter games I've seen. I've seen comparisons drawn to all sorts of games, whether it be Army of Two or Gears of War, Ghost Recon, you get the deal. The way I see it, developer Jaeger wanted to take the Gears of War games and then put a more realistic spin on them and then make it Spec Ops: The Line. I think they mostly succeeded in that part. In terms of gameplay, Spec Ops: The Line isn't really anything special. not compared to its campaign at all, but I mean, I don't really think it needs to be. Each gunfight you get in presents you multiple different ways to go through it, but you mostly have to look at them from a more strategic standpoint. You're forced into cover a lot in almost all of the gunfights you find yourself in. Your AI squad mates, I should mention, while they're far from perfectly developed, they do feel definitely more polished than some of the Ghost Recon Wildlands NPCs. That's not a dig at Wildlands, nor do I think the AI squad mates in this game are perfect, but they're a lot better than some of the ones you'd find in games like Gears of War, COD, Halo, along a few others. The level design is really good. I found myself appreciating how open a lot of the missions were in terms of their level design. They weren't very linear at all. My only issue with the overall level design is I do feel deja vu in a lot of places because of how similar a lot of the levels are. The animations, both in-game and in cutscenes, were really good and especially interesting to look at. Jaeger definitely took a style of their own with this game in terms of its animations. The controls felt to me like your average third-person shooter, but that was nothing I ever had a problem with. I was just fine with that personally. I like how realistic a lot of the weapons are. You run out of ammo really fast, so you need to savor it and then use it only when you absolutely have to. I would often find myself using sidearms and semi-automatic weapons even more so than the actually fully automatic guns, because those just ran out of ammo too quickly. The cover mechanics are nice as well. One thing that adds to the realism of this game is the fact that you're almost always in cover during gunfights. I also noticed a handful of times that there are destructible environments to the cover you're taking. It's not like Battlefield or Just Cause, but it's more of a way of telling you, hey, you've been in cover this long and now they're starting to shoot it and break it, take a different cover spot. It's something I noticed throughout gunfights in the game's campaign or multiplayer. There are also some choppy aspects to the game's gameplay as well, which I'll go over right now. I dislike the fact that the enemy variety was basically non-existent, so that meant there wasn't really much of a challenge for me. There are exceptions to this, for instance the heavies, but generally there wasn't much variety, which I didn't necessarily like. The movement tends to feel clunky at times, as well as the fact that I'm not really a huge fan of the gunplay. There are only a handful of guns in the game. None of the guns are outright bad per se, but it does start to feel repetitive using the same ones over and over again. This game also has this nice little kind of RPG element to tell you you're getting better at a certain form of combat. It doesn't really add anything to the story. I think it's just a nice little detail. Rockstar did the same thing in 2004 with GTA San Andreas. I feel like a lot of people tend to go too hard on the gameplay for this game. It's not revolutionary or outstanding by any means, but it does the best with what it's given. Not only that, but Spec Ops: The Line's run-of-the-mill style of gameplay is completely made up for by its outstanding campaign, which I'll get to right now. I do feel the need to warn you of spoilers in this section. This is an outstanding, excellent campaign, and I won't be held responsible for spoiling it, so if you choose to watch and spoil it for yourself, that isn't my fault. I would honestly say that Spec Ops: The Line's campaign is an absolute must-play for anyone that values good storytelling in their games. It's the type of game where even though there are multiple different endings, I couldn't see myself replaying it. Not because it's bad or anything, it's just because I don't think this game is really meant to be experienced multiple times. Taking heavy inspiration from the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, the thing that separates Spec Ops: The Line from a game like COD Modern Warfare is that Modern Warfare was marketed to be dark, gritty, and disturbing, whereas Spec Ops: The Line isn't marketed like that, it just shows you. It shows you instead of telling you. The game's disturbing content is brought up from a more psychological standpoint. One of the lead writers for the game's story, Walt Williams, admitted in interviews to being uncomfortable in several different points while writing the story due to the dark themes it presents. As I said earlier, this game's campaign is a loose adaptation of the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which I want you to keep in mind because it's going to be important as we go forward. The story's basic premise is Dubai got torn apart by the worst series of sandstorms in human history, and a group called the 33rd, led by John Conrad, are sent to evacuate civilians, but it goes horribly wrong, and now you're sent in. Your three-man squad consists of Walker, which is your character, the protagonist, as well as Lugo and Adams. The game opens up with a chopper gunner sequence, which doesn't seem like much at first, if not pretty generic, but it does make a connection later on, so stay tuned for that. After the chopper gunner sequence, Walker goes on in a cinematic about how Conrad helped him in an operation in Kabul. However, after an evacuation attempt in Dubai resulted in complete failure, you guys are sent in as a second attempt. Despite the order only being to evacuate civilians out of Dubai, Walker's curiosity gets the best of him, and then he goes on to find Conrad, which leads to the amazing rabbit hole that is this game's campaign. That's the story on the surface, but beneath the surface is where the campaign truly shines. There's a lot to go over, but I'll mostly be talking about Walker's descent into post-traumatic madness over the course of the story. One thing I want to point out I noticed is that as you go further down through Dubai, you also go down with Walker's mental state. His tone of voice changes as the game goes on. This game is a 6-hour-long downward spiral for all the characters involved. In true Heart of Darkness fashion, this game's biggest theme is most likely guilt, and that is most shown off in the white phosphorus sequence. Unleashing white phosphorus on dozens of civilians and then being forced to walk through the destruction and death you caused. It's genuinely one of the most distressing moments in gaming history, as well as one of the most shocking. What makes this scene truly remarkable to me is everything leading up to it that happens right before it. Using white phosphorus despite Lugo pleading with you to not do it, and then when you do it, it's similar to the mission Death from Above from Call of Duty 4, and you don't realize what you actually have done until you're forced to walk through your actions. Following the white phosphorus scene, you're walking through your actions, and then Lugo and Adam start arguing, and then Lugo points the finger at you. It looks like he's pointing the finger at Walker, but he's not. He's pointing the finger at you, the player, telling you how it's all your fault. This is only further driving down the point that happens earlier on in the game's opening credits where it says special guest and under it is your username or gamertag. This game wants to involve you straight from the screen and then take you and make you feel like you're in the shoes of Walker. It's a game that has you do something as simple as just kill another enemy soldier and then says, look, you took this man's life. Are you happy? Do you feel satisfied with yourself? You did this. It takes the standard appeal of shooters, drops it on its head, and gives it a concussion. Another example of Walker slowly starting to lose it is later on in the game when you complete the objective Keep Going Down, which is an objective that was never given to you in the first place. Now, this could have just been a bug that Jaeger left in the game by accident, but I feel like you could honestly look at it either way. In Chapter 5, you come across a banner with Conrad's face on it. However, when you encounter the same banner later on in the level, it's no longer there. In Chapter 12, while rappelling down a building, you see a hanging body, but if you look up, it mysteriously disappears. What I'm trying to get at here is that the developers with this game try to get into your head, in the same way that Walker's actions try to get into his throughout the campaign. And for the most part, for me at least, it definitely succeeded. When Lugo dies at the end of the campaign, he appears again a few missions later as a heavy that you have to kill. I feel like this can be interpreted in several different ways. Art is subjective, and I don't just mean that in the sense of I can like something you don't, or vice versa, but also you can interpret stuff in several different ways. The choices you make that lead up to the game's multiple endings aren't decided in the typical left or right decision or the Telltale style of decision where you press this button or this button to have a different outcome, but rather the gameplay options that the game presents to you. The game isn't all that restrictive when it comes to gameplay options that further the story, so with that said, let's talk about the several different endings. The first and simplest ending is Conrad counts to 5 and Walker commits suicide, which I think makes the most sense in the context of the story. The second ending is Walker shoots Conrad, which turns out to be a mirror, which is symbolic of what Walker has become over the course of the game. The second set of endings comes with a bit more gameplay. There's the third ending, which is where Walker is approached by a group of soldiers who apparently have been looking for him. You can either choose to shoot these soldiers that outnumber you and then they kill you, or you could just let them take you. If you choose the fourth ending and let them take you, one of them asks you, "How did you get out of this alive?" To which Walker replies, "Who says I did?" I feel like everybody thinks this is a metaphor for Walker saying that he's already dead, but I think it's basically just a metaphor for him saying that Dubai altered him to the point where he's a shell of a human that has no remorse or reflection for anyone anymore. Dubai changed him from a well-groomed standard soldier to a cold-blooded and remorseless killer. Another thing that escalates the tension in this game's campaign is, of all things, the loading screen tips. They start off pretty standard like your average shooter. Press RT to shoot, LB to throw grenades, press 4 to ejaculate for 5 minutes, but over time they get more aggressive, with quotes like, "To kill for yourself is murder, to kill for your government is heroic, to kill for entertainment is harmless." Or, "The US military does not condone the killings of unarmed combatants, but this isn't real, so why should you care?" Or my personal favorite and the most well-known, which is, "Do you feel like a hero yet?" I like to think these represent Walker's head head as he loses the idea of what morals even are. He goes so far down his own horrifying rabbit hole that by the end he has no regard for human life in the first place anymore. Spec Ops: The Line's campaign is exceptionally amazing, one of my favorite campaigns in any shooter ever now. It's a game that breaks the fourth wall in a way that would only ever make sense in a game. It would only work through the interactive format because then that's the only way it can make you yourself feel guilty. In your standard shooter like your Halo or your Battlefield or your COD, you just shoot your enemy and there's no consequence to it because that's the point of the game. That's how the game works, and then Spec Ops: The Line turns that concept on its head. You do all these things without self-awareness, all while thinking you're the hero until you're told otherwise. It's a truly amazing experience. I highly recommend this game just for the campaign alone. Seriously, you should definitely play it if you're into shooters. Spec Ops: The Line's multiplayer is mostly forgotten in terms of the game's campaign, which doesn't really surprise me because the multiplayer, unlike the campaign, isn't really anything to write home about. In fact, while researching this game's development, I found out that Jaeger didn't even want a multiplayer mode in this game in the first place, but it was enforced by 2K. The multiplayer in this game, as I said, isn't really anything to write home about. It's nothing noteworthy, it's in fact kind of a mess. Not only is it almost entirely dead, it took me like an hour to find a match, but when I finally did, the game was really broken in terms of its multiplayer. I'll start off by talking about the class setups. Officer, Sniper, Gunner, and Medic are classes that are shared by both teams, whereas Scavenger is exclusive to one and the Breacher is exclusive to the other. It includes a grand total of 6 maps and 6 game modes. There's Chaos, which is basically a free-for-all and the player with the highest score wins. Mutiny is your standard team deathmatch as well as the only mode I actually got to play. Then there's Rally Point. Rally Point is basically King of the Hill. Then there's Buried, which is honestly the most original mode in the game's multiplayer, which basically the premise is destroying the enemy team's vital points, which reveals a high-value target, and then there's a whole bunch of RPGs sprawled across the map. Then after that, there's Attrition. No, not that one. Love you, Respawn. Spec Ops: The Line multiplayer's Attrition is basically just tactical siege-style TDM. Last but not least, there's Uplink, which is basically a lot like Conquest. Multiplayer is the worst part of this game, bar none. Not only are there probably an amount of like 2 players currently online at the moment, but when you find a match, when that rarely happens, it's completely broken and it isn't worthwhile. More often than not, half the match consists of lag, all the weapons feel useless and completely weak toward anybody you're using it on. One thing I thought was really unique that I actually liked about the multiplayer above all the other things is the fact that, of all things, sand plays a role in the game's campaign. Please do not tell Anakin Skywalker about this. He will be very mad. If you throw a grenade at the ground, then the sand kicks up as it explodes in the enemy's face. You can even bury enemies with it, which I actually thought was pretty cool and unique. Still, however, this game's multiplayer is pretty dull. It's never really brought into discussion when people talk about this game, and that's with good reason considering how amazing and mind-blowing the game's campaign is. I can completely understand why Jaeger didn't want a multiplayer mode for this game. It just seems so tacked on, and most people don't even remember that it exists in the first place. Spec Ops: The Line received mostly positive reviews upon its 2012 release, and still to this day sits at a respectable 76 on Metacritic. The problem with this game's reception, however, is the fact that it underperformed. It actually underperformed really badly. A lot of people didn't play this game, especially considering the fact it was in competition with other shooters releasing that year, like Borderlands 2 and Black Ops 2. The game sold poorly enough to the point where now it's considered a commercial failure despite its overall quality. Even Nolan North himself has expressed how disappointed he is with how poorly this game sold. He even went as far as to say that if he could ask his Uncharted fans to play one other game, it would be this one. The game's generic name and cover art didn't help it. Black Ops 2 was on fire at this time, 343 was coming out with Halo 4, BioShock Infinite was on this way. We didn't really have much room for another shooter. It sucks because, as I've stated before in this video, this game has one of the best campaigns I've played in a shooter game ever, just period. This is one of those games that's really discussed, but not a lot of people have really played it. It's all the more unfortunate considering how underrated it actually is. Overall, I would say Spec Ops: The Line, as long as you avoid the multiplayer, is a spectacular experience that's worth your time. It's truly a shame how poorly this game sold due to its competitors. There's a lot to go over with it, as evident by this video that's coming up on 20 minutes long. There's something about this game's campaign that really elevates it from Modern Warfare or Homefront to me. I'm really glad that I picked this game up and then played it from start to finish. It's something that now I feel like I had to have experienced sooner or later. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The link to stuff like my Discord server will be in the description. As I just said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. More are on the way. My name is Johnny Seizure, and I'll see you soon. Bye.